This is Nikki Glazer from the Nikki Glazer Podcast. Have you guys seen this new commercial from Stand Up to All Hate? It's basically Snoop Dogg and Tom Brady going back and forth with reasons that they hate each other. But then when you really listen to them, the reasons for the hate are just so stupid. I don't know. This commercial really got me. It's a strong reminder that hate in our country continues to be out of control. So join us at iHeart in standing up to it. If you see hate, speak up, call it out. Your voice is a powerful tool in this fight. You can learn more by following at What's Up With Hate.
Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an AO7 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. It's often said that beer is made from just 4 ingredients: barley, hops, yeast, and water. However, it can be argued that carbonation is a 5th crucial ingredient responsible for providing the delightfully refreshing fizz expected in a nice pint. While most modern brewers force exogenous CO2 into their beer, traditionally, carbonation was developed by capturing naturally produced CO2 during fermentation. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to discuss natural carbonation, focusing particularly on the use of different priming sugars in a Trappist single, namely dextrose and Belgian Candi syrup.
I guess when you think about it, carbonation is kind of an ingredient in beer. And although a lot of home brewers are probably just using bottling sugar or forced CO2, there's actually quite a few methods at our disposal that allegedly can create different qualities and, types of carbonation in our beers.
Yeah, like most home brewers, at least those who got into the game around the same time I did, I started off bottle conditioning and only switched to kegging with forced carbonation after like 20 batches or so. Well, back then, it was highly recommended to just use dextrose, or what a lot of homebrew shops, like you said, Jordan, refer to as bottling sugar. And so that's what I used in order to avoid any, undesirable off flavors. Well, it seems these days brewers are using all sorts of different types of priming sugars in hopes of imparting some sort of a unique flavor or other characteristic to their beers. And when it comes to Belgian styles, Candi syrup is sort of a natural option. I've never tried this myself, but I absolutely look forward to hearing about your experiences with it, Jordan. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, February of 2025, is author, podcast host, and longtime figure in the world of home brewing, Drew Beecham. As you've all likely heard by now, the AHA recently announced that they're going to be completely disassociating from the Brewers Association, going totally independent as a nonprofit organization, and Drew is a member of their transitional board. For as long as I've known Drew, he has been dedicated to this hobby and those who engage in it, and I'm confident his inclusion in this transitional process is going to be a positive thing. Of course, patrons can ask him about anything else they want to, from his experiences making ciders and writing books on it, to working with Denny Kahn with experimental brewing. To be part of this session, make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday, February 21st, 2025, as Drew's going to be taking questions that Saturday the 22nd. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and YouTube pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allows you to do that, we would appreciate it immensely, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really like knowing what you think about how we're doing. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches and also their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric quite yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits at really reasonable prices. If you've been considering going electric, though, you got to do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, listener Scott Housel from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, shot us an email after we talked about the potential of adding the Hop Chronicles series to this podcast. Scott said, "Thanks for a great 2024. I'm glad to be a patron. You asked if we had any interest in the Hop Chronicles or other shows that might only be about half the length. I would still enjoy a shorter episode if that works better for y'all. I'd love to hear a podcast about the Hop Chronicles as well as Brew It Yourself, even if they were shorter. Maybe you could do some sort of double feature episodes, maybe not even the same contributor or topic, but 2 shorter episodes back to back as one. I'm just happy to get a new episode every week. You all have done many really great things for all of us. Much appreciated." Well, first off, Scott, thank you so much for being a patron of Brewlosophy. It's people like you who keep us doing what we do, and it's great to to know that this stuff that we're doing here is having some sort of a positive impact on you. Jordan, I don't know if it was you who was on that episode with me where we were talking about the potential of, integrating the Hop Chronicles and Brew It Yourself, but we have definitely talked about it among the crew. And it really just, I think it boils down to, coming up with a way that we want to approach those episodes so that they don't get boring. I guarantee you, we could come up with more than enough stuff to talk about to make one episode. I do not have the time to be producing 2 podcast episodes that we release at the same time. I want to stretch that stuff out just because of time limitations. But what do you think about that, Jordan? Do you have any thoughts about how we might approach the Hop Chronicles or Brew It Yourself on the Brewlosophy podcast?
Well, I believe this last week's episode of the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube was effectively a Hop Chronicles episode, and I thought it was a pretty good episode. So I think that if the YouTube channel can produce some good audio-visual content, why can't we on the audio-only side? And the Brew It Yourself one, that's a great idea. We've have some wacky beers, some kind of like interesting takes on kind of classic styles. I'd love to kind of unpack those. And I know that when I was a newer brewer, or even as a current relatively advanced brewer interested in a style I've never brewed, I'll often look for a podcast focused on that style and kind of just take an hour to listen to what it's all about and kind of take some notes. So yeah, I think there might be something there.
Yeah, in thinking about the Hop Chronicles, I after that episode where whoever the co-host was and I were chatting about it, I was able to kind of make a lot of sense out of the way we could approach the Hop Chronicles, at least, without just focusing on, the specific hop terpenes and what we might expect from that. There's a lot of history behind most hops, talking about their lineage, where they come from, stuff like that. Maybe that would be interesting to listeners. It would be to me. I know that. For Brew It Yourself, I think that's a shoo-in. It's just, we're going to have to be comfortable not going over data and facts as much as we are, our inspiration for why we thought doing this weird thing to a beer, would be cool. And so those are definitely on the list of things for me to get to organize the way we would approach those shows. But we appreciate your feedback, Scott. We actually heard from quite a few people saying they wanted to see that as well. I just wanted to address your double feature idea, because much as I love you for being a patron, we're not going to do that. I'm only releasing 1 episode a week at this point. So if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on naturally carbonating beer with dextrose and Belgian Candi syrup. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Whether lower in carbonation like many traditional British beer styles or spritzy like a Saison, many view carbonation as an essential part of the gestalt of a beer. Present company absolutely included. On the surface, carbonation can seem like it's a pretty plain thing, maybe even a boring topic, but I disagree. To me, carbonation is fascinating. Now, before we get into the impact different types of sugars have when used to carbonate beer, let's go over some generals first.
Yeah, so what the heck is carbonation?
Good question, Jordan. The term is referring to carbon dioxide. It refers to the process of dissolving carbon dioxide into a liquid, resulting in the liquid becoming effervescent. That is the basis of what carbonation is. Now, when CO2 is dissolved into a liquid, a weak acid known as carbonic acid forms. And this also has an impact on the way we perceive beer, on the total characteristic of that beer, lending a sort of tartness that can be perceived, at least in my experience, and I think from what I've heard from most other people, it really does kind of lend this crisp character to beer beyond what you might get from fermentation alone.
Yeah, and it's not an all or nothing game, right? You know, there's various levels of carbonation, which I guess in theory could increase kind of like the acidity perception, maybe with the increased, amount of carbonic acid. And so it's a really fun kind of lever that we can play with. And we'll talk more about the various types of ways you get that into your beer. But, basically at the homebrew level, we're either, pulling more pressure by adding more CO2, or maybe over a longer time period, or adding more sugar so that more CO2 builds up under pressure. And that's really the key, is that you need a closed system to hold that pressure in place and then ultimately take that CO2 into solution.
Yeah, there are plenty of factors that go into what actually happens during the carbonation process, regardless of whether you're using forced carbonation, natural carbonation, whatever. But the two key factors are pressure and temperature. CO2 is going to more readily absorb into cooler liquids than it is warmer liquids. And if anybody who's ever opened a soda that has been sitting in the back of a car that's warm knows what I'm talking about. That carbonation just comes bursting out, whereas if you've been keeping, I drink a lot of sparkling water. We do in our house over here. You keep it nice and cold and you open it and you get a little hiss. That's in part because of the that dissolving power of cooler liquids versus warmer liquids. But pressure is number one. Now, other factors do come into play, like density of the liquid or the liquid that you're carbonating. I can't even tell you, Jordan, how many times I've received emails about something that I have experienced my own, and I'm not entirely sure what the best solution is, which is trying to carbonate like a huge Russian Imperial Stout. It's just going to be different. The way that you approach that is going to be different. The way that carbonation it presents in that style of a beer is going to be different. So there are other factors as well. But again, key is pressure, and temperature. Those are the two main things. Now, I remember, I believe it was Drew Beecham, in fact, who had made a comment many years ago about how if you really dig down into history, there are so many things that you may not even know of that were influenced by making beer, by the brewing industry. And one of those happens to be carbonation. When you think about the history of what carbonation is, now we're going to get a little bit esoteric, but I love history. So, obviously the most ancient of brewers, right? Those Egyptians who were out there harvesting wheat and they set their clay pot down and it rained and all of that. They knew that when fermentation happened, there was something else going on that resulted in a product that had a little bit of fizz to it. But they didn't understand why that was. They didn't quite grasp how to get it into this liquid if you wanted it in there, whether you did or you didn't. So what's fascinating to me is back in 1733, this English minister, his name was Joseph Priestley, was living in a house next to a brewery. And he noticed man, there's this smell that comes off the brewery when they're making these beers, and you see this steam, or what he referred to as airs, that were regularly emitted out of this brewery. And then also he would drink these beers and they had that little prickly sensation to them. He was very interested in that. And at the time, naturally occurring spring waters were, you could go to these spring water resort type things, and they would serve you spring water that had this effervescence in it. And he started to, and they would always market it as like some sort of an elixir to cure all your ails, a sort of panacea. But Priestley is the first person who, or at least documented wise, first person to recognize that, hey, the fizziness in those spring waters is probably from the same gas or the same stuff that's making beer fizzy and that is being released from the top of these breweries. Well, this made him wonder if he could somehow artificially force what they referred to back then as fixed air. He didn't, this was too early to even be calling it carbon dioxide, or he at least didn't recognize that it was carbon dioxide. But he wondered if he could force this in some way into a liquid, which he tested out by combining sulfuric acid with chalk and then capturing that resultant gas in what else? A pig's bladder. And then he used that through some sort of mechanism that he set up to carbonate water. And this was ultimately the, quote, discovery of forced carbonation, which I find absolutely fascinating.
Marshall, that is incredible. I have never heard this story. I've heard professors talk about all sorts of ways you can get foam into your beer. Obviously, CO2 is a big part of foam, but I've never heard the story behind the, quote, discovery of carbonation. That is a really fascinating story, and of course, it involves a pig's bladder.
Well, and what's crazy is I hadn't heard of it until I was researching for this specific episode, despite the fact that we've done plenty of episodes on natural carbonation. This is the first time that I'm looking going, man, he was really doing a CO2 recapture and then reusing that. But in a way, it is a form of kind of natural carbonation. So impressed was society at the time that he ended up winning the Copley Medal from the Royal Society, which I guess was a very prestigious award in the 18th century. But it got him a lot of accolades for this discovery. Of course, he took all of those accolades and he took it and put all of that energy and what he knew into being a minister, as opposed to, but he was a minister who was very interested in science. And I just think that's a fascinating story. Now, obviously, this is kind of a hybrid. What Priestley was doing was this hybrid. He had the idea that, man, if we can capture these gases, these airs that are being released off of this, we can then take that gas and force it into a liquid. And for him, he lived next to a brewery, but I think he was mostly interested in water. And, those sparkling waters ended up being served at kind of high class restaurants and cruise ships across the English Channel or whatever it was. And it was kind of a fancy thing to do. Obviously, nowadays, it's just part and parcel to drinking most liquids is that level of carbonation. So real briefly, forced carbonation, to distinguish these two, involves forcing exogenous CO2, so CO2 that comes from the outside that's not being naturally produced during fermentation, into already fermented beer using pressure and time and, of course, temperature. And that is what most of us do. However, there is also natural ways, and I think CO2 is natural regardless, but what we refer to as natural ways to carbonate beer as well.
Right. And so there's an argument that you can get a different type of bubble through natural processes. And this is something I've experimented a lot with and have really enjoyed the effect of natural carbonation, but it is a bit more work. If you're kegging, it's just so easy to put that CO2 line on. And so you kind of have to, be willing to go along for the ride. So some different approaches for natural carbonation. One is krausening. That's a traditional German method where you add a little bit of fermenting beer or even unfermented beer if you wanted to into one batch. That is, at the end of fermentation or nearing the end of fermentation, you cap that or you put a Spunding valve on that to make sure that additional fermentation that occurs at the end of the first beer's process provides the amount of carbonation that you want. I'm not looking at any tables right now, but I think I've heard something in the realm of like 15% is about the volume that you want to add. At the homebrew level, you could make a little starter. You could, just pump in a little bit of Helles or something that you're fermenting next to it. A few different ways to go about it. It definitely works. And also a fun trick, if you're struggling with attenuation on a batch, it's one way to get a couple more points to go down.
Yeah, Kreuzening is I think about, when I think about the history of beer, the two regions that come to my mind, I know there's Belgium, and we're going to talk more about Belgium in a minute, but to me, it's really Germany and Britain, and they are the ones in my mind that again, kind of came up with a lot of the methods that, at least here in the United States, that we employ as homebrewers. Like you said, Kreuzening, you're adding fermenting beer to unfermented beer, a new batch of unfermented beer. You're using that nice, active, viable, and vital yeast to start fermentation in the next batch. The way I think of Kreuzening is the way I think of sourdough starters. It's almost like a Solera of sorts, like a backwards Solera, where you're keeping that same yeast going over and over from batch to batch, and you can put that into fermented beer as well, and it's going to consume some of those extra sugars as long as you cap it off and create carbonation. So long as you keep that beer under pressure. You mentioned a spooning valve. You can also carbonate just by spooning alone. And that is, again, another German technique. Very simple. Basically, you start fermenting your beer, and at some point during the process, whether it's at the beginning or towards the end, you spooned it, meaning you put a valve on that allows a specific amount of pressure to build up in that fermentation vessel, releasing anything above that, such that pressure is created and the CO2 then gets absorbed into the beer while it's fermenting. Again, like you said earlier, Jordan, I've not experienced, but I have heard that there are people out there who genuinely believe that these two techniques, Kreuzening and Spunding, whether used independently or together, is going to produce a qualitatively different type of fizz in beer. I can't tell the difference in the times that I've tasted those, beers that have been made those way. Carbonation is carbonation to my palate. What about your experience? Have you tried both of these methods, or?
Well, yeah, there are some, measurable effects. One on the Kreuzening side is you can also, you can drive a little bit more attenuation. And on the Spunding side, you can actually have a little bit less attenuation. What I've found is that your beer will struggle to go down as far if it's under pressure for the final portion. But the other thing with Spunding, and I'm not totally sure the effect of Kreuzening, because I haven't done it in a while in this regard, is you can get more sulfur in a lager because it's not blowing off or volatilizing off through that, blow off valve or airlock or whatever it is. So that alone is, could easily have an effect that's perceptible. But, what they say is you get these tiny bubbles from these approaches. And also, I think that you're able to get those from a kind of traditional bottling method as well. And so you can just get this really incredible meringue foam through these methods. Is this the only way to achieve that? Maybe not, but it certainly could be one way to get that really beautiful head of foam.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say, is that there are, when I think about that creamy, rocky, just smooth meringue-like foam, to me, that's more a function of the other ingredients and the methods used of making that beer, not so much carbonation. But I could be wrong. I've tried I've only Kreuzened like one batch, but I have a friend who is on a bit of a Kreuzening tear, making traditional German lagers many years ago, and those beers were great. Don't get me wrong. Same with beers I've had that were spooned. But the carbonation quality, again, to my palate, just tasted like carbonation. So it could be that I'm just not sensitive to it, of course. Obviously, I think the approach that's probably most familiar to our listeners and people who are at least home brewing is conditioning in the package. And this is where whether it's in a cask or a keg or bottle conditioning, this was widely used by British brewers. And it just involves adding a small amount of sugar to the fermented beer, basically adding just enough that the yeast kind of reawaken and start, consuming the sugar and metabolizing it again, producing a tiny, tiny bit of alcohol, but a decent amount of CO2. And so you add this sugar and then you cap the vessel, whether a keg, cask, or a bottle. And then it leads to re-fermentation. Re-fermentation is the key when it comes to natural conditioning, by the way. A lot of people, I remember back in the day, a lot of people would talk about no need for secondary fermentation and all of that. Well, if you're naturally conditioning, you're kind of doing a secondary fermentation anyways. And it can arguably do some of the stuff that was intended when people were actually racking to a secondary fermenter and such. But that's neither here nor there. The key is that when you're doing this type of carbonation, you are adding some source of sugar sugar for that yeast to metabolize. And that is going to be our focus from here on out, is these different types of priming sugar. Now, what is priming sugar? Very simple. It's any fermentable sugar used for the purpose of naturally carbonating beer. By adding it to fermented beer, one, quote, primes it for re-fermentation and carbonation.
Right. And so I think a lot of homebrewers, their very first batch of beer, this is exactly what they do, is they create a, priming sugar solution, typically corn sugar mixed with hot water, and you put that at the bottom of your bottling bucket, and then you transfer your beer on top, and then you go into your bottles. But there is always this debate in the homebrew world: which sugar should I use?
Well, I'll tell you what, the two that we're going to focus on today, one of them being dextrose, is again, in my world, that is the most popular source of sugar to use for any sort of package conditioning or natural carbonation in the package. Dextrose is just corn sugar. Apparently, it can also be made from wheat. I don't know if I've ever used dextrose made from wheat, but all it is glucose. It is a monosaccharide, meaning it's just that one molecule of glucose, meaning it's a simple sugar that is 100% fermentable by brewer's yeast, arguably leaving no residual flavor, just the byproduct, CO2, and that tiny little bit of alcohol. That's the reason why it was so widely used, is that you don't want to contribute any other flavor. You've put all this effort into making a beer that tastes the way you want it to taste. Now you just got to get carbonation. So you're trying to use the most flavorless, method for doing that. That was the thought. Now, this is kind of an aside, but I'm sure you remember back in the day, Jordan, when you would listen to a podcast or read on some forum that if you use table sugar, you're going to get an almost acetaldehyde like green apple flavor in your beer, and you got to avoid that. We've done plenty of experiments on that as well. Table sugar is sucrose, which is a disaccharide. It's two molecules. Table sugar is what is used to make Belgian candy syrup, though.
Ah, interesting. I didn't realize that. So I've never made my own, weird sugar, caramel, etc. for brewing purposes. I always just buy it at the store. So as I understand it, Belgian candy syrup is an invert sugar, where they take a sucrose, which is a disaccharide, and it's broken down into its individual parts, fructose and glucose, through a hydrolytic process, making candy syrup, which is technically a blend of two monosaccharides. So allegedly, this is sweeter than sucrose, and it's 100% fermentable and is a key ingredient in many Belgian beer styles, or at least we Americans think it might be.
We think that about so many other regional styles, like, oh, it's got to taste like bubblegum. Yeah, you go to Belgium and they don't really taste nearly as the bubblegum that we expected a Belgian beer out in the U.S. is kind of a caricature of what a real Belgian beer tastes like. But yeah, the invert sugar thing I think is fascinating, and I forget exactly the process. We did an experiment. Greg Foster many years ago did an experiment comparing store-bought versus his own homemade Belgian candy syrup, and there is a process. You have to slowly bring it up to heat, to a certain temperature. And I think you add, I forget if it's an acid or something, but just stuff that's easily acquired at the grocery store. But it is invert sugar that, like you said, and this doesn't make any sense to me, but it's perceptibly sweeter than sucrose, but also still 100% fermentable. So I'm thinking about it this way. You've got dextrose and you've got this inverted sucrose. So you've got these Belgian candy syrup having these two monosaccharides, fructose and glucose, kind of floating around together in this nice amalgam. But they're both 100% fermentable. And if that's the case, then any flavor difference that we might expect would be because of the byproducts that the yeast fermenting those sugars is producing based on the molecule of sugar that's being fermented. I mean, does that make sense? Am I off on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, that in theory makes sense. Whether we can actually taste a difference, who knows? And so that's kind of what I was wondering is like, well, what about in the bottling stage? Does the bottling process make a difference? There's been debates around whether you use honey or maple syrup or something like that, whether you'll actually pick anything up in the bottle. But what about like just a kind of really simple sugar? I mean, we'll talk more about the experiment in a little bit, but I use the lowest level of color. So Belgian candy syrups have different, color ranges all the way from like clear to dark, and Belgian double, Belgian quad, they might lean on some of those darker sugars, but this really simple, clear one, like 0 or 1, whatever number they give it, is it really taste any different once you actually ferment it out in the bottle?
That's exactly it. And if it does, what's contributing that difference? To me, you parse it down to its the molecular level, literally here, and you've got, a glucose versus a sucrose and fructose, or fructose and glucose mix. It would, I guess, the part that I get hung up on is that they're both 100% fermentable. So if 100% of it is fermenting out, the only thing that could be contributing a different characteristic would be the molecular difference. And I think that's fascinating. But you could probably already sense my bias that, yeah, I don't think that there's going to be much of a difference just off the top, because they're both fermenting out 100%. So other things you want to consider, though, besides just the flavor and aroma impact, would be the carbonation character. We talked about it earlier, that there are some beliefs that different types of sugars might contribute a different quality of carbonation. Doesn't make sense to me why anybody would think that, but people believe that.
Right. And, these things don't cost the same either. Like, Belgian syrups are obviously going to cost a lot more than table sugar or dextrose, right? So given the cost difference, is there actually a carbonation character benefit to justify the cost? That's really what I wanted to find out.
Oh yeah, I'm looking right now at just some Belgian Candi syrups. I'm looking at like D45 or the Golden. $20 for 2.5 pounds of this stuff. I can go get 5 pounds of table sugar or even dextrose. 5 pounds of that's going to cost way less. So is it worth it on a cost level to do it? That's the reason we do these experiments, is because, hey, if I can save $15, over the time carbonating my beers, and it doesn't really have much of a perceptible impact, why not? So now let's focus a little bit, just talk about Trappist single, because this to me is a perfect style for this type of a test, because it's already going to use probably, at least here in America, the same type of Belgian Candi syrup that you might use to carbonate it. So you already have some sitting around, in essence. The BJCP provides the following description of the Trappist single: a pale, bitter, highly attenuated, and well-carbonated Trappist ale, showing a fruity, spicy Trappist yeast character, a spicy floral hop profile, and a soft, supportive, grainy, sweet malt palate. Perhaps more importantly for this variable is it's supposed to have medium-high to high carbonation that can be somewhat prickly. If I'm drinking a Trappist single, my brain fully expects almost soda level carbonation.
And Marshall, in my opinion, really the only way to achieve that is bottle conditioning. I guess if you have 100 feet of like beer line, maybe it's possible on draft, but that's the beauty of this style, is this crazy high level of carbonation. You have this beautiful chalice where half of it is this meringue foam, and you just really struggle to achieve that on draft. And so that's why this is such a beautiful style to put in a bottle with that sugar re-fermentation, maybe using, even Belgian Candi syrup to get that incredibly prickly carbonated beer.
Yeah, and it is, for whatever reason, you wouldn't think it, but it seems to be that a lot of brewers struggle to get that higher level of carbonation in their beer. I think part of it, probably a good majority of people who struggle with that, it's because of their serving side stuff, not necessarily their process for forced carbonation. But yeah, even when you can do it, right? I had a one tap in my old 7-tap Keyser that was dedicated to high carbonation liquids, and I made a Trappist single. I thought it might have been a triple, actually, that I wanted to be basically prickly. I put 20 line, a 4 millimeter line on there, 20 feet of 4 millimeter line on that tap alone. And even then, the beer would pour slow. It'd be nice and meringue. It would have that look, but there was something I felt that was just different about it compared to one that is bottle conditioned, in a nice thick Belgian amber bottle.
And that's precisely what I do. Is I actually have a fleet of really thick Belgian brown bottles, because I really like these super highly carbonated Belgian beers, both on the Trappist side and kind of like the mixed fermentation side. And you want to make sure you don't have bottle bombs. And so you need a really strong bottle to make sure it can handle really high levels of carbonation. So 3.5, 4.0 levels of carbonation. You do not want to use like a repurposed Sierra Nevada bottle for that.
You will be blowing up bottles like crazy. That's the one time I've seen bottle bombs. It was not in my own brewery, but it's when somebody was trying to make a highly carbonated Belgian ale and they used regular brown amber bottles. If you don't know what we're referring to, hit Google, Belgian bottles. You will see the difference. They are much thicker. If you go to your local, bottle shop and you buy a traditional Belgian ale, chances are it's in one of these bottles and you can repurpose that. So, well, even since I switched to kegging and forced carbonation, I've naturally carbonated many beers with a few different types of sugars, but I've never used Belgian Candi syrup myself. That said, the idea of using an ingredient to carbonate a beer that was already used in brewing said beer really makes a lot of sense to me, but would it have a perceptible impact? That's exactly what you aim to find out in an experiment you recently performed, Jordan. We're going to be getting into those results right after this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Are you opening a brewery or have you already? Did you know More Beer has a pro division? MoreBeerPro.com is your brewery or brewery in planning one-stop shop for all your brewing needs. From complete brew houses and accessories to fermentation and even cooperage, they've got you covered. More Beer also has the largest selection of malt, hops, chemicals, and other brewing products of any vendor at low wholesale prices, all of which can be delivered on the same pallet, saving you and your brewery even more on shipping costs. Visit MoreBeerPro.com today to sign up for an account and talk with one of their knowledgeable brewery consultants.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. To the modern beer drinker, carbonation is perhaps the last thing they focus on in a nice pint, though if you remove it, it'll almost certainly be a source of disappointment. Everyone's going to notice if they get served a beer that doesn't have carbonation, but when you get it with carbonation, you just don't really think much about it. Well, as brewers, we tend to geek out on these things, especially considering the various ways a beer can achieve its quintessential fizz. Jordan, you recently performed a really interesting experiment comparing dextrose to Belgian Candi syrup when used to naturally carbonate a Trappist single.
Yeah, this is a style you want a ton of carb in, so what better style to use as the template for testing the type of carbonating sugar? So let's get into the recipe. Really simple recipe, and this was actually one that I won an NHC Gold with, so definitely give this one a shot if you want a pretty decent representation of Trappist single style. So this is just 100% Pilsner malt. You could use Belgian, you could use German, and we're just going to do a kind of simple single infusion mash at 147F or 63C for 60 minutes. You could do a step mash, but this one we just did a single infusion. Boil that for 60 minutes. I'm using 75 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh at 60, 26 grams at 20 minutes, and then I'm switching up the hops at the 12-minute mark using 69 grams of Satz. And I'm actually at this point adding a little bit of Belgian Candi syrup. I'm using that light 1 SRM, and it was the 5% of the grist. So already we've introduced some Belgian Candi syrup into the larger batch, but not both halves of it will get it at bottling.
Yeah, the thing about Belgian, what I love about Belgian beers is they know what they do well, and it's not like they're pining after doing everything on their own. Typically, the traditional hop varieties that are used in Belgian ales are likely going to be your noble hop varieties, that originated from Germany and obviously the Czech Republic. And so this is just an absolutely beautiful recipe. And to note, I mean, congrats on winning NHC Gold. That's amazing. Always a feat. But also, brewing a style like Belgian Single doesn't take much work. You can make a gold-winning, beautifully, delicious Trappist Single using a fairly simple approach, which I think is pretty rad. Now, again, that Belgian Candi syrup, 1 SRM, keep that in mind. We're going to put a little pin in that because it was already used in the beer. And the reason we do that is just to drive attenuation. You want this to be an extremely dry, very effervescent, very, very clean and easy drinking beer.
Right. And really the origin of using this for the bottling sugar, just like you said on the last segment, is I had some left over.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, let's keep the tradition going. And I don't want this expensive, bag to go to waste. So after that boil, we quickly chill that down using a wort chiller, and my refrac reading was 1051 OG. This is a fairly, low, moderate, level of ABV in the realm of Trappist beers. And so right where you want it to be. So at that point, I let that wort settle for a little bit before I transferred it to my fermenter. And I used my secret weapon for Trappist Single, Bootleg Biology OB Belgian Ale. I did win an award, but I really think that this yeast won that award. I just happened to be the steward of it. So we fermented that beer at 66F or 19C for a few days. I like to start my Belgian beers kind of at that 65F range. You don't want to start too hot. And then I raised that up to 75F or 24C after a few days. Then took a hydrometer measurement after a couple days, and we were down to 1003 FG. That's right where you want it to be, really dry.
Yeah, exactly. You go 1051 down to 1003 thanks to that amazing Bootleg Biology OB Belgian Ale. This is going to be a very nice beer so far. It's you got it nice and set up, and this is where we introduce the variable.
Yeah, so at this point, I was ready to bottle the beer and introduce the variable. So I prepared 2 priming sugar solutions that were calculated to achieve 3.2 volumes of CO2 in the bottle. What was interesting is you actually need different amounts according to the carbing calculator. So dextrose was 60 grams dissolved in 118 milliliters of water, whereas the Candi syrup took 85 grams dissolved in that same amount of water, which I then actually added to kegs and used my Blickman bottling gun to bottle these into some thick brown Belgian bottles. You squirt a little CO2 in there just to be safe, but it's actually a really nice method to bottle, and it ostensibly introduces less oxygen along the way.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got kegs and you want a bottle condition of any style of beer, really, those are the best source for you to do your blending of the priming sugar with the whole batch of beer. I know people who bottle condition by just adding small amounts of their priming sugar solution or even carb caps to individual bottles. I've done it. It works. It is way less controllable in my experience than by, mixing it with the whole batch. I'm fascinated by the fact that you have to use less dextrose than you do Candi syrup. And again, the only thing that makes sense to me is the fact that, dextrose is its own thing. It's a monosaccharide, whereas Candi syrup are these 2 monosaccharides that were split apart, in the inversion process. Something about those different sugars creates more carbonation, even though both are more 100% fermentable. It's just something that doesn't make any sense to me, and I couldn't figure it out in the, what little reading I was able to find online about why you need more Candi syrup than you do dextrose. But either way, both of these, based on the calculator that you use, just to be sure, were designed to give the same exact amount of carbonation, which is 3.2 volumes. That's correct, yeah?
That's the idea. And, appeal to authority, trust the calculator.
I mean, I'm going to trust the carbonation calculator every time because I do not like bottle bombs. So
No, but we want a lot of carb in there, and that's why you need that thick bottle. So after we get those filled, I put them in a couple cases and left them in my basement, which was about, that's right. I think I made a little carbing chamber. So, you can use like a heat pad and a temp controller and actually keep that at 72F, unless you have like a hot garage or something. I didn't. So I was able to keep them at an even 72 degrees for 2 weeks to ensure that, really robust carbonation. At that point, I moved them into a refrigerator so they could chill out and so I could serve them to tasters.
Yeah. And again, anybody who's ever bottle conditioned, which I have to imagine is probably the majority of people listening to this, the warmer you store those bottles, the quicker that carbonation is going to happen. And so 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22C is ideal in my opinion. Where I live in the Central Valley of California, you would not want to store bottles that bottle conditioning in a hot garage in the middle of summer because it can get up to 105, 110. And that's way too warm. I would not recommend that. But if you have the nice thing, if you have a full kegging setup, if you have your fermentation chamber and you've got the full homebrewing setup, just because you want something bottle conditioned doesn't mean you can't use gear that's intended for, kegging and forced carbonation and all that. Throw those beers into a fermentation chamber, set your temperature to wherever you want it, and you're off to the races.
Right. And so what I do is actually I use like a big igloo cooler type of thing and put the Inkbird temp probe in one of the boxes next to like a bottle, and then lay that heating pad on top of it, close the igloo chiller, and it will maintain that desired bottling temperature. And that's something I rigged up, kind of my idea. I'm sure I'm not the first one to do it, but the idea behind this is really, again, an appeal to authority. When you read Brew Like a Monk, they talk about how the Trappist breweries will store their beers in warm rooms during this bottle conditioning phase. So just again, trying to make this beer as authentic as possible, as I tend to do.
Absolutely. And you said that once they were 2 weeks at that 72 degrees Fahrenheit, you move them to a fridge, you let them sit there for a week in the fridge so they're nice and cold and the CO2 is well dissolved at the time that it comes to collect data for this experiment.
So before we serve this to tasters, of course, I want to taste it myself. So just looking at it in a glass, they looked very identical, both pale, yellow, a little bit of haze because, they didn't, bottle conditioned cold for months before I started tasting them. Crazy white foam. I calculated this to be 3.2, but it felt like 4. These were so incredibly carbonated. It was actually kind of challenging to get it into a glass. You really need that big chalice because then you can actually have the space for all that foam. But wow, it was a wonderful beer. Really great recipe. And I really think that the carbonation is part of the recipe. And so if the goal was to get highly carbonated Trappist singles, I think we did it.
Well, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of talk about, different glass styles, will present the beer differently to your nose and to your mouth. I'm not sure I believe all of that. But one thing, if you look at where these different styles of glassware came from, a chalice works beautifully for highly carbonated Belgian beers, not because of aromatic or flavor stuff on its own, but because it holds that highly carbonated beer with the foam on top. So it makes sense on a practical level to use a type of glassware like a chalice for this type of beer. I'm looking at these. I don't think our glasses that we use for the experiments really do the carbonation and the foam justice, but they do look like great Belgian singles to me.
Yeah, it's really hard to pull a little 4-ounce sample of a super carbonated beer.
Yeah.
So I'm sure taking the photos for this was kind of a challenge for me to try to get it all set up and do it right. But, if you have a beer that's this carbonated, it's not going to work very well in like a Pilsner, flute.
Yeah.
It's just going to be too much foam. And so, but it's time to see, do they actually taste different? So we do our own little personal triangle test, semi-blind. So I know what the variable is, but I don't know which beer is in which cup. And I got it right 1 out of 5 times. I mean, these things tasted identical, smelled identical. And in terms of like the prickly, character of the carbonation, identical. So as far as I could tell, so I think that it at the very least achieved the same or similar levels of carbonation, but it didn't seem to differentiate the beer in terms of like the flavor or like the quality of the foam, neither in like my plastic cups or when poured in 2 different chalices. So as far as I can tell so far, they seem to make very similar beers regardless of the 2 sugars we tested.
Well, and that to me, that's interesting, right? On a purely anecdotal level, the person who made these beers, who knew everything about the variable, and who used a calculator to predict the amounts, which were different of the different types of priming sugars, you couldn't even tell them apart. And I think that's telling on its own. But obviously we do serve these beers to blind tasters. By blind, they can actually see, but they don't know what the variable is. In this case, you served it to 20 participants, out of which 11 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that, yeah, it really does seem that Belgian candy syrup used as priming sugar creates a different perceptible quality compared to dextrose. But out of the 20 participants who actually tasted these beers in the triangle test, how many actually got it right?
Only 4 of 20, which is 20%. And obviously that is not significant if we needed 11. So we have some degree of confidence that tasters could not reliably tell two beers apart where one was bottle conditioned with just standard homebrewer corn sugar and the other one with the expensive, fancy Belgian Candi syrup.
So here's the thing. When you support the null that there really is no difference between these, you can't really extrapolate much from that. But we're homebrewers doing this on our own. What we can say is that these beers, to both tasters and the dude who brewed the beers and knew everything about the variable, just tasted essentially identical and had, we say taste, but I think in this context, we really need to refer to the carbonation level. You could not tell them apart. Tasters could not tell them apart based on the quality of the carbonation that was in these beers, regardless of whether it was carbonated with Belgian Candi syrup, priming sugar, or dextrose. And I think that's pretty interesting. Up top, I told you that going into this, I was sort of biased. I wasn't the brewer, so I'm happy to admit that my bias was there from the beginning. I didn't think they were going to taste much different. I would be curious to see, if you compared, say, the D1 Candi syrup, so that really low SRM Candi syrup, to say like a D60, they're going to be different colors, but you use so little, to carbonate the beers as the priming sugar is that even going to impact the flavor of the beer when you use that? And then we really get into my brother, for example, sent me this delicious brown ale that he made. He lives out in Buffalo, New York. Maple syrup is very common out there. I've been to a maple farm in Buffalo, and he carbonated it with maple syrup. I didn't taste maple in it. Could you, if you were to compare, say, maple syrup to dextrose, would you taste the difference? I think it opens up a lot of avenues for experimentation.
Right. And so I think it also is kind of a relief that you don't have to spin the coin on this product, at least when it comes to bottling. It's just a sugar re-fermentation in the bottle. So I would be more focused on getting that carbonation in there, as opposed to like the source of the carbonation. And the caps of foam looked really similar. And so some of these variables that we test have really more of a visual difference in theory, whereas there might not be much of a taste difference. But in this case, everything really seemed the same other than the source and the amount used.
Yeah, and the cost. I mean, dextrose is significantly cheaper than Candi syrup, and you could argue that table sugar is even cheaper than dextrose just because it's so widely available anywhere you go. And go look on the website. If we haven't done an episode on it yet, I'm sure we'll get to it in the future. But comparing for bottle conditioning, at least, or natural carbonation, comparing sucrose, your table sugar, to dextrose really doesn't seem to produce much of a difference, at least in my memory. So, again, keep in mind what it is you're after. I get that there's kind of this romantic belief that by using something that tastes really good on its own for bottle conditioning, that it's going to contribute this, je ne sais quoi to the beer, so to speak. Maybe it doesn't, though. And so it's fun to experiment. It's fun for us to test it out. And so I'm glad we did this. We did get a couple reader comments that I wanted to focus on. First one comes from Daniel, who said, I've visited several Belgian breweries, and I have yet to find one that uses anything but regular old table sugar. Once I learned that, I started using it also, and neither I nor judges have ever noticed a difference. Daniel, I'm right there with you, man.
Yeah, you've heard stories of people that go to a Trappist brewery and just see these giant sacks of table sugar sitting around without a bit of Candi syrup in sight. So, I guess that's a different kind of appeal to authority, but I think that our experiments have continued to show that it is really challenging to taste a difference based on sugar type alone. Yeah,
and it's, again, the part of engaging in a hobby is going down rabbit holes just for the sake of going down rabbit holes, regardless of what you find at the end. And so I'm all for people messing around with different types of sugars or whatever it is. But economy of scale, efficiency, these are things that big brewers are thinking about. And if you like their beers, at least when it comes to the ingredients they're using, you might want to take a tip from them. I think it's interesting. And again, you can save a lot of money by avoiding some of the more expensive types of sugars, at least for bottle conditioning. If you're going to use a dark brown sugar at 10% of your grist compared to white sugar in a beer, maybe you'll taste a difference, if you're making some sort of a triple or something like that. But for bottle conditioning, I just don't think there's enough sugar in there. Vaughn Stewart, final comment, left this one on Facebook. He says, it's almost like yeast don't care about a non-existent chemical difference. Who could know?
Right. And that's the fun part about experimenting. You don't know until you actually try it. And both made a great beer. And really the beauty of this, candy syrup method is, at a certain batch size, you can use about half of the package for your boil sugar addition, and then just use the remaining half for your bottling. Or keg conditioning for that matter, right? And so it's like, why let it go to waste? I'm not brewing Trappist beers, every week, more like once a year. So it's just, if you have the sugar, might as well use it. If you don't, you're going to be just fine with, your standard table sugar.
Yeah, more than anything, and this will be what I would want to leave our listeners with is make sure that you're minding the bottles that you're using because you don't want to create bottle bombs, and use a good calculator. Most of the Brewfather has an excellent carbonation calculator that I would recommend. Use that so that you know what you're getting into here. Making a mess and potentially injuring yourself because you want a really carbonated Trappist single, not worth it. Make sure that you're doing it right. So that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Do you have any final comments, Jordan?
I just want to implore our listeners to bottle their Belgian beers. It's such a beautiful expression. You get so much wonderful carbonation, and you can hold on to them for a while. They really hold on a long time. Kegging is obviously easier. Bottling sucks. We all know that. But there's just something magical about a nice Trappist beer in a bottle. And I really encourage people to go back to their roots and give it a shot sometime.
It's such an ideal way to go back to your roots, like you said. And sometimes tapping into that can remind you what it was that made you fall in love with this hobby in the first place. What I would implore you to do, Jordan, is a comparison of forced carbonation to bottle carbonation in a highly carbonated Trappist type of ale, because I'd be curious if do you have to set up your forced carbonation rig so that it has really long lines and the serving isn't what causes the difference to be perceived. But that is neither here nor there, and that is for the future. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Brewlosophy Show over at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. Martin is producing some seriously incredible beer and brewing content over there that we're sure you're going to love. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.